So this PowerPoint is designed to help students engaging with the study of Macbeth for the first time. My students are boys in year 10 and they'll be reading Macbeth as part of the new Edexcel IGCSE syllabus this term. And this PowerPoint is designed to help them to engage with the text before we start. I've put a link here on this page which will take them to other writing that I have placed on my blog for people to use. And there are essays here on the Porter, the Witches, Macbeth, Lady Macbeth, and so on. And although I think I wrote these a couple of years ago for A-level students, I would ask any student interested in looking at these not to be put off, but to read them, make some notes, and generally get yourself ready for the study of a Shakespeare play at this level. And what I want to do with this particular screencast rather, is to talk about a couple of things that I think we need to understand, even if we don't refer to them hugely in the course of our studies, in relation to the plays of Shakespeare. This play, like most of the others, is a mixture of what we call verse and prose. Verse simply is poetry, and prose more the form of writing we might find in a novel or continuous writing we'd find in any piece of fiction or non-fiction in the 20th or 21st century. Generally on the page you can recognise verse at a glance by its layout. It rarely is a rectangular pattern, and in fact seems to be containing quite often lines of very random lengths, but that's a visual trick, if you like, and it's often not the case. Shakespeare wrote in what is called iambic pentameter. When this doesn't run at the time in Shakespeare, it is known as blank verse. Now, iambic pentameter, which sounds quite fancy, is a Greek term for a very simple idea. Each line is made up of a pair of syllables called an iamb, and this pair of syllables form one unstressed and one stressed syllable. So we might perhaps imagine the rhythm da-dum. 5 of these units of da-dum make up a line of 10 syllables in length, 5 times 2, and the basic form of that is, of course, the Pink Panther theme. And it is, which might be a surprise, but if you hum the well-known tune, da-dum, 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 you find that you've hummed an iambic pentameter as long as you stop there. So all you need to do now, if you like, is to add a line or two from the play to prove it. And what better place to start than the first thing Macbeth says as he enters in Act 1, Scene 2. So foul and fair a day I have not seen, he says. But if we look at that as metre, da-dum, so foul and fair a day I have not seen, and suddenly we see how the 10 syllables flow easily off the tongue as Macbeth enters, and we remember that each of these ba-dum units is an iamb. Now, if we sat and listened to somebody speaking in iambic pentameter for 3 hours, this would be very, very dull. And Shakespeare tends to alter things depending on character and mood. So one of the ways that I often think about this and try to encourage children to think about it is to imagine each unit, each iamb in this case, as a domino. And you can place your dominoes in a line until you've got 5 of them. And obviously you shuffle them around. And so he uses this to create variety. For the witches, for example, who open the play in Act 1, Scene 1, he only uses 4 dominoes. He makes what the Greeks would have called a tetrameter. When shall we 3 meet again? When shall we 3 meet again? It doesn't even quite work, but it's very clearly not a full pentameter. There are actually only 7 syllables, of course, in that line. Not only does he alter it in this way, but he uses verse as a medium of speech generally for high status characters. As a rule of thumb, the lower in status you are, the more likely you are to speak in prose. It's also an indicator that if a high status character is losing status, they too might gradually end up speaking in prose. When Duncan first arrives at Macbeth's castle, he's very clearly speaking in verse. This castle hath a pleasant seat, the air nimbly and sweetly recommends itself unto our gentle senses. We'll have a quick look at this on the next slide, but it's interesting, isn't it, that in verse, a medium which is full of rules and you can have this many of this type of word and so on, we can get so much variety into the writing. By the time Shakespeare wrote this play in 1606, he was an absolute master of verse. So when we break these 3 lines down, we can see minimal but important alterations in the metre. The first line works perfectly nicely. This castle hath a pleasant seat, the air. But even there, we can see that he's calm, iambic pentameter. He is, of course, the highest status person around at the time. But if we break the line down, this castle hath a pleasant seat. There's a semicolon there, so we get this castle hath a pleasant seat. The air, and he carries on. Now this break in the line here before the final pair of syllables is technically called a caesura. And caesuras are breaks in a line of poetry caused by punctuation. And there is a sense there that we have to be aware of this. Why does he break there? Why doesn't he break at the end of the line where we would expect him to? Maybe because he is royal, he can have this bit of game that means that the line, the air nimbly and sweetly recommends itself unto our gentle senses, and flows through 2.5 lines there, increases his sense either of the spaciousness of Macbeth's castle, or possibly just of the grandeur of the king himself when he says it. But it brings us to the opening of the second line, and you can see here that it's not a typo, for a change, if you're used to my screencasts. But you can see that instead of da-dum, I've started this second line dumdy with the word nimbly. And my point about this is that nobody would say nimbly and sweet. It just wouldn't work. Thus, what Shakespeare's done here is used a different domino, or he's turned his iamb domino the other way around, if you like. And this is technically called a trochee. And it allows for a stress on the new word. It also allows for a nice spring to the rhythm. He's saying that the air is nimble and the air is sweet. Nimble, easy moving. And there is a real bounce to nimbly and sweetly recommends itself. And there's a real sense at the beginning of that line, that dum-diddy-dum-didum-didum is a nimble movement. Unto our gentle senses. Now here again, we only have 7 syllables, and I'm not going to get into a debate about whether the word unto is unto or unto, if you see what I mean, or even unto, double stress. It works perfectly well in every way. What's interesting here is that the line is only 7 syllables long, and what Shakespeare does here is he allows Banquo to finish the line. So the last group of syllables, this guest of summer, as Banquo carries on, enable this line to finish neatly. It also possibly suggests that the king and Banquo will dovetail together as like minds in a way that the king and Macbeth never will. So just to recap, if we have an iambic pentameter, and when we talk about iambic pentameter, that simply means a line comprised of 5 of the units da-dum, so 10 syllables in all. A trochee is a single unit dumdy, the reverse of an iamb. A caesura is a break within a line of verse caused by punctuation. And also we've noticed that when writing in verse, Shakespeare will often split a line of iambic pentameter across 2 or more characters. It can add speed, urgency, and as we've seen on the previous slide, can also be used for other effects. But he doesn't always split the lines. Shakespeare plays have very, very few real stage directions. There's very little advice to the actors. And interestingly, unlike prose, verse, because of its tight structure, can be used to create dramatic pauses. And if we think about it, if we're used to the rhythm of the Pink Panther, we expect it. And so the effect of stopping short can be confusing. If we start going da-dum, da-dum, ba-dum, ba-dum, ba, and don't complete the line, we still hear it in our head, possibly. We hear the rhythm go on if we know the tune, but it's created a gap. And a good example of this comes in Act 3 at the banquet scene, when Macbeth, looking at the ghost, and say, "Thou canst not say I did it, never shake thy gory locks at me." split over 2 lines. So the second line here, thy gory locks at me, is only 6 syllables. So in Act 3, when he's horrified, Macbeth seems to cut a line short. There's no indented response. There's no cry from the next speaker, no indent of the next speaker's line to make it look as though somebody's actually speaking the line. Of course, the ghost can't answer him anyway. Which means that in our minds we hear the silent da-dum, da-dum. Thy gory locks at me. Da-dum. And during this time, a pause is built into the drama. Maybe Macbeth is looking at the ghost, imagining all these gory locks being shaken. People at the table are confused, looking round to see what's going on. And Shakespeare, by using verse, but by cutting the verse short, has helped us to visualise in our mind the ebb and flow of the action on stage. When you're reading, always look out for these gaps. They can confer stage effects, they can confer cues to the actors. The last thing I want to look at as a starting point here is the 2 words thou and you. Again, in the years I've taught Shakespeare and other writers from the 17th, 16th centuries, this always seems to cause confusion, this idea of thou and you. And I think students quite often get quite hung up and confused. And it does surprise me at times, and if people have studied MFL, presumably you're familiar with the 2 vous or du and sie issues found in French and German, where there's a singular and plural version of you. A formal and an informal, as we're often told, or the other way around, informal and formal. In the 17th century, although it was dying out by this stage, English still had 2 forms of second person. Thou, the singular, the informal, and you, the plural or the formal. Thou is used by adults to children. It's also used between close friends. It confers equality, and anybody who's lived in Germany is aware of the fact that certainly amongst adults, there is a time that passes when one first makes new acquaintances before you are invited to use du amongst yourselves. Time, if you like, for the friendship to develop and for trust to develop. So the shifts in thou and you really matter, and there's a very nice evidence of this in Lady Macbeth. Lady Macbeth, at first in Act 1, seems to use thy or thou and you to Macbeth in a relatively interchangeable manner. One perhaps signifying her love and understanding of him, her closeness to him. The other, the formal response required to a thane, and a man who they hope will be king, from a woman, albeit one of the most powerful and terrifying women in literature. But once she sees him to be scared, once she sees him to have lost his power, and she perhaps loses respect for him, she shifts to you for the rest of the play. And it's as though she no longer has any affection for him, and he's become a high-ranking stranger almost in her mind. I've not told you where this happens in Act 1, and I'm going to expect students that I'm working with to find it for themselves. What's interesting is that once she drops thou, she does not use it again towards Macbeth for the rest of the play. Thou can also be used as an insult, particularly when somebody of high status speaks to another character of high status, i.e. to an equal, but is no friend. Thou can be perceived, therefore, as an insult because it's as though one is addressing your equal as an inferior. It implies status all the way through. So with that in mind, I think we're probably ready. It's worth remembering all the time, Shakespeare did not write in order that his plays would be read, and he certainly didn't write for students in the 21st century to study at IGCSE. He wrote to be performed, he wrote language that should be heard, and I expect to hear you in class when we're engaged in reading. If that means that you take some time to prepare ahead, brilliant. That's actually what I'd love to hear. No embarrassed mumbling, go for it. In the end, you'll always get out of a text in proportion to what you put into it. I hope that that's been helpful, and I hope that we're going to have a great time this term studying Macbeth.